Hello there. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak praised the benefits of Brexit, and the International Monetary Fund predicted a severe recession for the country on the same day. But how is Britain really doing? It indeed is time for a balance sheet. Listening to Britain's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak these days, one might think that Brexit is driving the country from one peak to the next. On the occasion of the anniversary of the EU exit, which marked the third anniversary a few weeks ago, Sunak praised the great progress that the country had made in making use of the freedoms created by Brexit. As examples, Sunak cited the fastest distribution of vaccines in Europe, trade deals with over 70 countries, and gaining back control of borders. We have confidently embarked on a journey as an independent nation, is what the Prime Minister said in a statement released from his Downing Street residence just a day earlier. So, is everything fine in Brexit Britain? The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, on the other hand, came to a very different conclusion on the same day. In its new outlook, the organization in Washington warned that Britain could be the only leading industrialized country where gross domestic product is shrinking this year. For us in Germany here, for example, the IMF expects only slight growth of 0.1%. In Great Britain, however, the economy is expected to shrink by 0.6%. The IMF did not mention Brexit in its outlook. Instead, the organization blamed the country's heavy reliance on gas imports for its dismal assessment and the fact that the workforce has still not returned to pre-pandemic levels. High interest rates, which skyrocketed after Liz Truss' chaotic 49 days as Prime Minister in the autumn, would also have pushed up the cost of mortgages. Brexit supporters are fond of pointing to the rapid distribution of COVID vaccines, which put the UK months ahead of mainland Europe. In December 2020, the British Regulatory Authority for Medicines, MHRA, was the first regulatory authority in the world to approve the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and vaccination was then launched nationwide at lightning speed. But it had nothing to do with Brexit. The approval of the vaccine and the start of the vaccination campaign both came when the UK was still in the Brexit transition period. At that time, the country was still part of the EU's internal market and customs union. Great Britain could have managed this accelerated solo effort even as a full EU member. The real advantage over countries like Germany was the centralized national health system NHS and its comprehensive data register, through which the vaccination campaign could be efficiently organized nationwide. The more than 70 trade agreements, which Sunak also praised as a Brexit achievement, turn out to be downright shams on closer inspection, because almost all of these agreements are copies of EU trade agreements, which London, after consultation with the other side, adopted unchanged. Only in the case of the trade agreement with Japan was London able to get some additional agreements on services. The deals with Australia and New Zealand, which have been celebrated with a great fanfare, bring virtually no economic benefits for Great Britain. While the government speaks of additional growth of 0.01 to 0.02% over 15 years. No, on the contrary, British farmers could, for example, find themselves in trouble by importing New Zealand lamb if the barriers to trade are dismantled over the 15 years as it is planned in these agreements. And there's also a problem with the border control, which Sunak also mentioned, because London and Brussels are still arguing about how the special status of Northern Ireland should be regulated in the long term. The region is the only part of the UK to remain closely tied to the EU after Brexit, and the local economy is booming, much to the suspicion of Brexit hardliners. Brussels was recently willing to compromise, and they are still negotiating, but still, London will have to make long-term concessions to finally get the issue off the table. If you look at 2022 and 2023 together, then the sobering forecast by the International Monetary Fund doesn't look so bad anymore. According to estimates by the IMF, the British economy grew by 4.1% last year, but most of all, the country has made up for lost ground. In 2020, the British economy shrank by 11% because of Boris Johnson's government's botched initial response to the pandemic. As of September last year, Britain was the only country within the group of G7 whose economy was still smaller than when the pandemic began. And to date, the workforce in the UK is lower than when the pandemic began, with multiple implications for the economy. Brexit plays a central role in this. And finally, after the end of the Brexit transition period in early 21, the country closed its borders to workers from the EU. Kind of. In a joint study, the think tank Centre for European Reform and UK in a Changing Europe come to the conclusion that the country has 330,000 fewer workers because of Brexit alone. That's around 1% of all employees. And this is having a particularly severe impact on the hospitality sector, on transport, trade, and the healthcare system. Some leading Brexit supporters within the economy are now calling for the strict visa rules to be relaxed again. And budget watchdogs from the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR, assume that the British economy will be permanently 4% smaller than it would have been without Brexit. As the UK is no longer part of the single market and the customs union since the end of the Brexit transition period, a number of new rules apply to British companies exporting to the EU. Only new to them, those are old rules, but now new to them. Extensive customs formalities are required for exports, and the financial and organizational effort is so high that smaller companies, that many of them have stopped exporting to the EU. And when the British Chamber of Commerce, the Trade Association, recently conducted a survey of around 500 companies, more than half said they were still struggling with the new system, still new to them. A similar number of companies reported difficulties in obtaining visas for employees. In a recently published study, the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin came to the conclusion that the volume of British exports to the EU fell by 16% as a result of Brexit. Imports from the EU are therefore around a fifth lower than without Brexit. And already after the EU referendum in 2016, there was a problem with investments in Great Britain. These practically dried up after the referendum. In a study, the think tank UK in a Changing Europe comes to the conclusion that the volume of investments would have been 25% higher without Brexit. Economists at the International Monetary Fund believe that the multiple imponderables of Brexit have prompted investors to invest their money elsewhere over the years. The consequence of this will probably only become noticeable in many areas over a period of years. But the lack of investment is already hitting one industry with full force, and that's the automotive sector. The number of cars manufactured in Britain fell last year to its lowest level since 1956, and the reason were supply chain difficulties and plant closures, and the latter are associated with Brexit. Britain has long been admired for its stable political system, but the much vaunted stability has been gone since the 2016 EU referendum. After the British decision to leave the EU, a bitter dispute broke out within the governing Tory party between opponents and supporters of leaving the EU. The negotiations with Brussels also dragged on for years because London apparently had no idea for a long time what they wanted to achieve with Brexit. And even now, 3 years after Brexit, talks about the future of Northern Ireland continue. An end to the political uncertainty, is not in sight, even when they always say there's progress. Because the Brexit hardliners and the Tories are now setting the tone there. One wrong decision by the government, from the extremist point of view, could trigger a civil war within the party at any time. And this is one of the reasons why Prime Minister Rishi Sunak looks as if his hands are tied all the time. In view of the chaos that is constantly brewing, the country's leading business leaders have little choice but to back for stability. More and more of them have been visibly reclining for months at the thought of a Labour government. And the British public does not miss how bad things are with Brexit. According to a recent survey, 58.5% of Britons now believe that the country would be better off in the EU. But even aligning with the EU will be terribly hard. And there already is talk about Boris Johnson blackmailing Sunak to post a rebellion if Sunak finds any deal with the EU on the Northern Ireland Protocol, the protocol that Boris Johnson signed himself, by the way. And now he's fighting it because he knows he's got the right-wing extremist in the party on his side still. He left office not because of the extremists. He left office because he didn't have the support of the more moderate part of the party. The more moderate part that cannot get anything done because of the strength of the right-wing hardliners in the party. And that's a big problem. And by the way, during the whole video, you heard my voice. Carnival season is over now. When you're seeing this video, it's so-called Ash Wednesday in Germany. Now fasting time until Easter starts, and that's the end of Carnival. But Carnival took its toll, as it does every year, because you're so much outside, even when it's raining, when it's extremely windy. So I caught a cold. I'm doing as much as I can do in work still until I can't talk anymore without coughing. That's the one reason why I try to make one longer video in the morning. But I will not be able to do 3 videos a day because I also have the magazine for the other channel, and then my voice will be gone. And that's why, unfortunately, this is the only video today. And in the next few days, it probably will be the same case, that you'll get one a bit longer video at 6 in the morning, and you have the whole day to watch it. Then you can try to watch it in pieces or in parts. But I will have to reduce it a bit to get rid of this fracking cold. Same every year. But I know that a lot is happening. The next days I will try to fit in also the part of Boris Johnson's new premises and why that location and so on. But we'll talk about this. And I'll see you in my next video, this time tomorrow, but I'll be back.